Hello, and welcome to this episode of To the Point, Tanium's interview series where we sit down with public sector thought leaders to share and exchange ideas on the latest trends impacting government technology professionals and discuss how they're working to solve today's most challenging priorities. I'm Claire Bailey, Public Sector Chief Security Advisor at Tanium.
And I'm Chris Cruz, Public Sector Chief Information Officer at Tanium. In this episode, we're sitting down with Teri Takai, Senior Vice President for Center for Digital Government and renowned public sector technology leader, to dive into critical intersection of government strategy and infrastructure security.
Teri, thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Well, thanks, Claire, and thanks, Chris. It's fantastic to be with you. Kind of two of my buds from past days. So it's really, really fun to be here.
We really do get to say back in the day.
Exactly. Don't say that too often, though, Claire.
Yeah.
Well, Teri, wanted to really get into the questions in terms of leveraging you as really a critical asset with eRepublik and your previous jobs of holding CIO jobs, both obviously in the private and public sector, but really based on your experience in synchronizing government, national defense, and critical infrastructures like transportation and healthcare. What have been the biggest advancements in looking to leverage cybersecurity tools for protecting critical infrastructure and citizen services?
Well, Chris, before we get into some of the very specific tools, I think it is important to note that what we're really seeing finally, and we'll get into critical infrastructure even more, is that we're starting to see government actually talk about a whole of state approach. Now, certainly this was promoted, if you will, in the recent funding. But at the same token, we all know that the funding that was allocated by the federal government wasn't necessarily adequate to do everything that needed to be done. But at the same token, it was a catalyst. So whether a state used a grant process or whether they actually contracted such that local governments could take advantage of it, the dialogue around whole of state has changed and changed dramatically as a result of that. And I think that what's come with that is all of you, and certainly Tanium has been at the lead, has really been to help the CIOs understand how to do whole of state, what that actually means, and also helping them get out to have that conversation about what whole of state means and how they can actually implement it. So I just wanted to kind of open up with that perspective because I think the tools are important, but the relationship building and the governance structures and being able to actually talk about that. Both of you, have been on both sides of this, and you know how important relationships are. And, you're out there, I know, evangelizing and talking to people. And I just wanted to make sure, that we talked about that piece of this, before we kind of get into the tool piece. I think if we look at the sort of technology capabilities that are really helping, it really is around looking at a total, if you will, I hate using the word platform, but it's really thinking about, where in fact do we need to protect our data? And it's at the endpoint, but it's not only the endpoint from the standpoint of the endpoint when there's a human involved. We're now talking about IoT, we're talking about sensors, we're talking about very old systems. I certainly know from, my days of, really working with this. So there's the, kind of the IoT aspect of it. There's the endpoint perspective from the standpoint of the users. And then, of course, there's, what's in the cloud, what's still in our data centers. So it's that holistic look. And being able to have the tools that bring all of that together. The second thing is it's really that single pane of glass. So it's being able to get those real-time data. And then what goes with that, the third one is having the tools, many of them now, obviously AI enhanced, but with continued AI capabilities being added. So that it's not only the notification of an issue, but in many cases, it's the remediation of that issue. without anyone necessarily having to be in the middle to make that happen. And that then, I think, really addresses what will continue to be an issue, but what I believe will change, and that is the shortage of cybersecurity talent. The more that the tools are capable of handling and being able to manage the increased volume of threat, being able to manage the increased sensors and, if you will, the signals coming in, and be able to analyze those, make decisions, actually mitigate, you're going to see cybersecurity professionals take on some different roles as well, and potentially, hopefully, some of the jobs that are around the pure monitoring will be taken over by the automation, and we'll be able to deal with, if you will, the challenges of having a skilled workforce.
I say this often, that I think you probably have the best job in the world at the Center for Digital Government. And we're talking about AI and automation and how it enhances the security and resilience of what we do. Workforce, to me, working my way up in government to be that chief technology officer for a state, I got to know my teammates very well. And you get to know skills we all have and how we work together as a team. AI and automation introduces something new to government, in my opinion, because we have a workforce, and it's the demand for cybersecurity people with those skills is just continually growing. I believe one of the last counts was over 300,000 open cybersecurity roles. So can you guide or give us your perspective on how, if you were in the CIO role today with AI and automation leading a government team, how would you leverage it, especially in the delivery of public services and government services? And also, how would you help your team grow to embrace those new automation and security tools that we have?
I think that one of the challenges that we all face is there's a piece of what we would do as CIOs and CTOs, and you did this very well, which is around how do you get people more familiar with the tools? How do you help them understand the capabilities? But there's another piece, which is the connection to how does it make a difference in the business? And that is really the point you're making around the delivery of government services. And so I think that one of the things that is going to have to happen, if you will, from a staff perspective, is that we talked about business relationship managers for a long time, but it's going to be really important that we see, number one, how these tools are going to be able to create more efficiency in government. Not just about cybersecurity folks, but are we going to need as many analysts? Are we going to need folks? The second thing is their roles are going to change. They're going to be able to access data much more easily. They're going to be able to get the analytics that they need much more easily. So I think the first step there is in understanding how the roles are going to change, because data are going to be much more available to people, and they're going to be able to make decisions faster. And that there's no place that is going to happen more than with network analysts, cybersecurity analysts, those that today are really looking at broad swaths of data and trying to look at patterns, trying to understand where in fact there's threat versus where there's noise in the system. And I think that is going to start to change the role of the cybersecurity analyst and move them up a level, if you will, and potentially looking more proactively at what the threats are out there, and then understanding how they have to protect. So I guess to summarize, number one, for a CIO's team, it's definitely going to be around the cybersecurity team elevating their game. It's going to be around the business analysts and those that are delivering applications, elevating their game and thinking about the delivery of services as well as efficiency in government. And then I think we're going to see an increase in being able to work with the agencies around the next wave of technologies that are coming. We've talked about this forever, but if you look at transportation organizations, health and human services organizations, all of this technology is hitting them at the edge. They don't really know where they need to be with it, if you will. And I'm exaggerating to make a point, but how should a transportation organization be thinking about protection of their data? How should they be thinking about, where they need to protect it at the edge versus, at the collection point of the data? So there's going to be, I think, this sort of evolution where we're going to have to get our folks ready to not think about their data in a data center or their data in a server, but much more around this kind of ubiquitous use of data. And then what does that mean from the standpoint of organizing it and protecting it?
Terry, you talked about that almost 10 years ago in terms of looking at data
Mhm.
centers and the utilization. It's funny you should mention that almost a decade later. So
Yeah,
speaking,
Chris, and we still have some folks that are doing it. So
I know,
we're
I
going to
know.
have to elevate their
True.
game. And not make them afraid that they're going to lose their jobs,
Mhm.
but rather, help them to understand how the skills they have are going to be translatable into what's coming.
Absolutely. So
And find
speaking of,
those early adopters and,
Yes,
and then have that structure to embrace change. I think it's an exciting time for our
it
industry.
is. Kind of one of the things that, I've sort of been saying to the CIOs, and some of them kind of look at me like, yeah, why is she really saying this? But what I really felt like was that, what I would be doing is to pick out 2 or 3 individuals who used to be our off the reservation people, where we were constantly trying to pull them in. And I would let them loose to see what they are finding, what they can do. Because you need, to your point, kind of those spark plugs in the organization. They're kind of at the edge, if you will, in a different way of on the edge, to come back to you with some ideas that maybe we don't think about because we're sort of used to the structures that we have today.
so speaking of essential features, Terry, give us your perspective on what a robust security environment looks like, a modern one that can address threats, including Internet of Things, critical cybersecurity attacks, breaches, or incidents.
So as we think about what a robust cyber environment is going to look like going forward, because I think the number one is the conversation we were just having, and that is recognizing just the sheer volume of data and information that's going to need to be managed. It's no longer going to be from transaction-based systems where an individual was actually responsible for those data. It's now going to be coming in from a broad array of sensors, drones, you name it, right? And even if you think about caseworkers and the amount of data that they're going to be processing now, the customer experience or the constituent experience, to your point, Claire, is changing. So the number one piece is understanding the magnitude of the data. The second then is to be able to have access to those real-time data through the AI capabilities of companies like Tanium to be able to, quote, make sense of it, and to be able to pick out where the threat vectors are, to be able to pick out what the remediations need to be, and be able to then, make those determinations. The second piece of this is going to be, again, going back to the data, is we're seeing now an interesting explosion in data centers, not necessarily data centers that governments are going to run, but all of the cloud providers are now investing in data centers. And all of that means more data. Now, there's an interesting implication to that, which is the power grid and the power structure behind it. But again, the ability to have access to those data and the transfer of those data in a very protected way, I think are going to be some of the areas that you're going to see companies address. And you're going to see companies actually look to working with companies, like yours in terms of what is that right strategy going forward. Now, the other piece of it is they're going to be looking to you guys to keep up, to continually address and be bringing in new products that help them deal, with that explosion of data.
Terry, building on everything we've talked about today, there's one key component that I've always was a goal to ensure when you're leading a government that you could get and secure funding for your initiatives. And there are some initiatives that may be a new delivery of service, a new mechanism, but in particular, how do we as a community, how do those leaders in the CIO role and the CISO roles today across all of government, can we effectively communicate risk to secure funding for cybersecurity and for protecting our critical infrastructure?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you it's tough. Critical infrastructure has always been really difficult in terms of understanding who's responsible and where should the funding come from. I think that both of you remember where it was a big deal when we were actually introducing the power companies and the water companies into our SOC, right? Way back in the day. So it's not necessarily just purely a funding piece, Claire. I think, first of all, it's going to be very important, and state CIOs are doing better with this. But it's going to be important to build those relationships in terms of who are the players in the critical infrastructure. Because in some cases, it is going to be the critical infrastructure providers, but in other cases, if you think about when there is an emergency, it's also going to be some commercial entities that potentially are providing supplies. You start to think about supply chain. So I think number one is very definitely thinking whole of state and whole of government in a different way than just city, state, and county, but including critical infrastructure in that conversation. The second piece, I think, is going to be looking at that collaboration. And the third piece that goes with that is the identification of what is the responsibility of government from the standpoint of being able to reach into critical infrastructure, and then what is the responsibility of those critical infrastructure providers, right? And that is two things, right? One is the critical infrastructure providers that are not part of government, but then what is part of government? And again, those are your transportation organizations, your environmental protection organizations, anyone that is putting infrastructure out there that touches the citizen, that reaches the citizen and protects the citizen. So I think starting to parse it out into the different ways that we talk about critical infrastructure, and then finding the pockets of money that we need in order to secure is going to be, I think, really essential to making some significant progress.
One of the interesting things that I see, and I think you may see it as well, as the reporting structure that we see across the country. There's no standard. I know that sometimes you will report, CIO may report to the governor, sometimes they may report to an administration, sometimes they may be in their own independent shared services organization. And so does the message change when you're the CIO delivering it to someone who is then going to deliver it to someone else? Do you see any trends there, or what do you see from your perspective?
Well, Claire, you've identified, I think, the major and challenge for the CIOs today is that difference in reporting structures. And I'm seeing a couple of things. I think for those organizations and those CIOs who don't report into the key top executive, there's a pro and con. So first of all, for certain topics, I am seeing CIOs be able to get to the top, if you will. So even if they don't necessarily report in, there are areas where, if you will, a governor's office or a mayor's office or a county executive's office may look to the CIO and the CISO, for guidance. So for instance, I'll give you an interesting example. I had some city CIOs come and talk to me and say, we're being tasked with civic innovation. We're being tasked to go outside the structure we normally work in. That's a good sign, Claire, and I think that is something that is going to be important, but I still think, Teri's opinion, there are too many who are buried and who maybe have so many messages that they have to kind of navigate their way through. So, just to summarize, I mean, I don't think the CIO has to report in, but the CIO has to have a voice to be able to convey, some of these really critical issues and not have to wend their way through the bureaucracy. The second thing is that while the money conversation is important, we can't get buried in the money conversation. Because many of these things, it's very difficult to be able to say, well, what happens if, a road system gets shut down? What happens if? There are ways to try to quantify that, but if it's only a quantification and a money conversation, you're moving away from the whole concept of risk mitigation, and how, in fact, you talk about it in operational terms.
I do think that your perspective is so well timed, because sometimes we have started to see things happen the more integrated everything gets. What does happen when something fails? And so it's an interesting time in which we live right now, to also understand there are tools that help. So, and I love the comment, it's not just about the money.
Yeah. And too, Terry, one of the things you always taught me in government was to make sure the chief revenue officer was one of your best friends.
You got that. That's a great person to take to lunch. I
Yes.
always made that a priority.
I learned that well, whether it be at the legislative body of state government or the board of supervisors at the county level, it worked
Yeah.
out to be successful. So speaking of money in terms of grants, with CISA's new state and local grant frameworks, how can effective governance be established beyond just meeting CISA requirements, beyond just utilizing enterprise contracts?
Well, there's really two sort of focus areas that CISA's taken on that I'm excited about. Obviously the state and local grant frameworks that have been established, I think, even though there's different approaches to it, are being effective, right? Again, because regardless of whether it's a whole of state contract or whether local entities have to apply for funding, in some ways, what's been interesting to me is that it hasn't really mattered, but because either has created a whole of state conversation that I've not seen to this level in the past. It used to be, Claire, as you know, state by state, right? When I was in Michigan, the governor was worried about, how local government impacted the budget issues we were having. So there was a real drive to a whole of state. I think, Chris, in California, it kind of depended on the day when I was there. But I'm so excited because I actually had a local government individual come up to me at a conference and say, the current state CIO is making really great progress. She's reaching out. So I think we're seeing much more effective collaboration. Governance, maybe not quite so much yet in terms of forcing anybody to do anything is the way I look at governance. But I really believe that the sharing has increased. I think it's beyond just the contracts and the money. It's around actually collaboration and actual sharing. I think we're starting to also see that collaboration, not necessarily just up the chain and down the chain. You're seeing cities come together to determine how best to use their monies. Cities and counties do collaboration. So is it, completely where we would like it to be? No, but is it certainly better than what I've seen in the past? Absolutely. Now, the second piece of it, which I think is going to be fascinating, is the memorandum that's just come out on critical infrastructure security and resilience. And let me tell you why I'm excited about it. I'm excited about it actually from looking at it from my former federal perspective. You know, sometimes it's easy to look at the federal government and say, well, those guys kind of work well together. Well, they kind of don't. And in order to really address critical infrastructure, each of the federal agencies has a different role and a different perspective. And they also guide their kind of sectors, if you will. And so CISA coming together and actually laying out a comprehensive plan that has roles and responsibilities for each of the federal agencies in their sectors, and hopefully, of course, money will follow at some point, is a big step forward. Because if you're in a state, you're in a really difficult position of, number one, having to adhere, if you will, to the overall CISA cybersecurity guidelines. But now they have also, from a critical infrastructure perspective, sector guidelines. So how, in fact, do they interact with transportation? How do they interact with environmental protection? And so there's going to need to be sort of a rationalization of those, but at the same token, being able to address those responsibilities very specifically around what is each federal agency responsible for is a big step forward to moving sort of with that specificity, Claire, to the point you were making around, you know, how do we get better at this critical infrastructure piece? Well, looking at specifics and responsibilities for specifics, I think is going to go a long way. And it's going to be interesting to see how this rolls out and how it evolves.
I have to say, in my career, that I have really worked with CISA and studied CISA and what they're doing at the federal level and how they're communicating with us around cyber risk and everything. And I think that ties into what we're going to see next. And I love your perspective on this. As those sector type things get identified and adopted, how do you feel that that's going to translate to our tribal communities, to our cities, to our counties, to our states? And do you see that those guidelines and those items that they're kind of paving the way for what good looks like and helping rationalize? How do you think that translates, considering all the different capabilities and constraints that we have in each of those components of where government employees are and people just trying to do their best every day with the tools they have access to?
Well, I think that there's an opportunity and a risk, as there is with everything, Claire. The thing that, again, really gives me hope, right, is that, you know, the guidelines that CISA put out in that memorandum, first of all, start with a set of principles. So if, in fact, each of the sectors takes those principles to heart and thinks about how they fit into the whole, then I think that gives me great hope, right? It's not each one trying to create on their own and not thinking about the impact from a whole perspective. The challenge, though, is the one that you've identified. There's always the risk that I'll pick on Department of Transportation for want of anybody. And again, certainly if anybody's listening that is from transportation, please don't take this personally. But there's always the risk that one sector will define a set of requirements that's going to be different from what another sector does. And if you're a state CIO or a city or a county CIO, you're taking all of those in. So now you're worried about, okay, if I get a compliance audit, or if my ability to meet these requirements is a part of the criteria for me getting grant funding or name your tune funding, then it becomes difficult. And then it puts the states and cities and counties and tribal nations in a very difficult situation. Now, I'm hoping that doesn't happen. I'm hoping that there's a consideration of the broader CISA guidelines as the sector guidelines are developed. But it does raise a conversation that I've been starting to have, which is all of these guidelines are very important, but how are we looking at compliance? In other words, we don't want compliance and the need to adhere to something which is really good be an inhibitor to innovation, because you're now worried about audits and you're worried about how's this going to have an impact. So I think it's going to play out, Claire. I'm not negative on it at all. I think that any structure and governance is important. And again, as I said, I like the specificity of this and the laying out of roles and responsibilities. I just think that we always have to be watchful of anything like this to make sure that we're not trying to govern by rules that make it actually harder to get things done. It's that fine line of the, being able to make sure that those are the closest to the decisions, have the flexibility to make the decisions that they need to make to serve their constituents.
It's always amazing to speak with you, Teri, and your insights just really have been, you've served as a mentor to so many of us. And thank you for sharing those wonderful insights on our session today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, absolutely. You're two of my favorite people. Just absolutely enjoy. And any conversation like this is fantastic because it really makes us think outside of what our daily responsibilities and kind of our daily conversations are, and kind of makes us think into the broader conversations. And when we think into the broader conversations, it looks brighter. There's always a few challenges, but it actually brings technology to where the three of us have always wanted it to be in government.
Absolutely. And thank you again, Terry, for sharing your insights. We really appreciate that. And again, thank you all for watching. I'm Chris Cruz.
And I'm Claire Bailey, and this is To the Point.